Hello, everybody. This is Thomas Kresge. You're looking at here a time lapse of my arranging of Night of the Wind from Sonic and the Black Knight. This was arranged for the MAGFest Community Orchestra, performed at Super MAGFest 2026, conducted by Robert Luke Martin, and the lead vocal part was performed by the original vocalist, Johnny Gioeli. So this time lapse is sped up about maybe 30 times the rate I was actually working at. And to maybe explain what you're looking at here, so this arrangement is going to go out to a gigantic orchestra with, like 12, 13 woodwind parts, about the same brass parts, a couple less maybe. Strings, percussion, rhythm section, choir. So it's a bunch of huge things to deal with. But with literally any arrangement I do, whether it's a small group or a big group, it's going to start with just a few staves. And usually just the bottom three you see, near the bottom three, is about all we're going to have, where you see most of the work happening here. And that's where I consider the arrangement happening. You're going to notice here that I'm going to, for the most part, separate the steps of orchestrating and arranging as kind of two separate processes. And I try to be pretty disciplined with that because the more I adhere to that, the faster I tend to get through the arrangement. And it becomes just a lot less overwhelming. It's tough to deal with 40, 50 lines all at the same time. In fact, probably impossible, to be honest, without moving extremely slowly. Of course, we didn't start from the very beginning of the process. I already had some of the score finished before I actually hit record on this. And the bottommost line is really just a lead sheet transcription of the original piece. So it's there for reference. That vocal line is mostly going to be copied over as the lead vocal part, but it's the very first step I actually did was just transcribe the original, not in its entirety, just the melody line, and figured out the chord changes and maybe like some important vocal harmonies or background lines that were happening. And in addition to the main three staves that I'm orchestrating on, or not orchestrating, but arranging on, the upper ones are all vocal staves. So we've got the solo vocal part on top and then the rest of the choir underneath. So this is just to make sure I'm actually like thinking about what the choir's doing throughout, so that they don't just get forgotten about till the end. They kind of need somewhat unique parts because I can't just really copy things over the same way I might with other instruments. And they need words as well, and they might actually sing some of the melodic stuff without the lead vocalist. We do break out to a point where the lead vocals just go away so that the choir can kind of have a feature. So speaking of things that were already kind of figured out before this recording started, was the overall form, and that's usually where I start, is getting the structure of the piece figured out. How long is the intro going to be and kind of what it's going to be like, what it's going to sound like, and then how we go through each section, literally just the form. And then maybe kind of roughly figuring out the ending. So I want basically the skeleton of the piece all worked out, and then it kind of becomes a process of just filling in the blanks. In this case, I didn't really mess with the structure much. It's, I think, pretty much identical to the original, and that was because it is a song, and I didn't really want to mess with removing a verse or something like that. There wasn't really a great opportunity to do that without it sounding kind of awkward. So this is largely left intact. So the biggest maybe part of that structure making task was to just kind of figure out how I was going to handle the introduction, because I didn't want it to sound exactly like the original. In fact, for this entire arrangement, the goal is not to just like make a rock song with an orchestra backing track, but to actually make it sound like a piece of orchestra music first. And there's some orchestration choices I do to sort of reinforce it sounding idiomatically orchestral rather than just a rock song with an orchestra behind it. So to figure out, to kind of, this moves very quickly, so it's going to be tough to necessarily like pick out exactly what I'm doing. But for the most part, I'm just going through each section of the song and figuring out how I want it to sound. Figuring out, I mean, the chord progression's already known, the melody's already known, so it really is just what do I want the accompanimental background parts to sound like? What do I want the textures to be like? And this is important since the textures are going to help sort of influence the flow of the piece. And we have, in this piece, there's 2 verses, and then the chorus happens like 3 separate times. And there's like one little interlude or bridge section. But because of all that, I want some variation between each instance of, say, the chorus. And so a lot of the effort in this is just figuring out how to make each chorus feel different than the other ones and to have the whole piece build. So, and we're figuring out new textures that kind of help with that throughout. Now, at this moment, there was a section that I'd already kind of like, I'd not finished arranging the piece. What you're seeing with all these extra staves is me starting to kind of orchestrate ahead of when I probably should be, but I was sort of stuck on what to do for some of the other moments, and at least these 2 sections I'd kind of figured out, so I wanted to just orchestrate it out to see how it was going. I'm actually going to end up re-orchestrating those sections later anyway, as I kind of organize things better, but that was just sort of to kill time but until I could think about fixing the rest of the arrangement. So but we are seeing some important stuff go up here. So the bottommost staff is just the lead sheet, like melody and chord changes, very simple. The next 3 though are my sketch staves. For almost every single note that's going to be in the arrangement will be found on those 3 sketch staves at the bottom. And then there's like 6 or 7 staves above that are the pre-orchestration staves, I call them. And we're actually at that pre-orchestration stage at this point. So I'm taking what's on the arrangement staves at the bottom, or the sketch staves, I should keep calling them, and figuring out who's playing what, sticking them on the pre-orchestration. So rather than working from like 11 or 12 brass parts all at once, I'm looking instead at 3 staves for the brass, 1 for trumpets, 1 for horns, and 1 for all of the low brass. And this is where I actually am thinking, okay, I have this number of players or parts I need to split things up to. I might add notes if I need to. If I am adding notes or changing things, I do always refer back to the sketch staff, because a big reason to be working from a sketch to begin with, and maybe even just calling it a reduction is better, because it's not really a sketch. I'm not just sketching things out. All of the notes there will be in the arrangement. The advantage of working from that is that I am seeing how every note fits together very clearly. It ensures that I'm not creating any weird dissonances, that my harmonies are correct and consistent, that my voicings are not muddy or anything like that, and that each texture kind of has room to not be stepping over everything. It's really easy to really overwrite big music like this by just writing on one staff and then the next, and then things kind of layer on top, and you just kind of end up with a whole bunch of stuff going on, but it's become sort of incoherent. So the reduction just helps make it easier to tell what's going on. And if your reduction's hard to read, then the music's probably too busy or messy, and you should be kind of rewritten from there. But then the reduction moves to the pre-orchestration staves, where I'm actually deciding who's playing what. And the staves are basically just a reduction of individual sections of the orchestra. So again, the brass had 3 staves. I think the woodwinds ended up with 4 because there were so many parts. There's one just for the flutes. And then oboes and clarinets were on one. And then low woodwinds on another. And I believe I put all 4 saxophone parts on a 4th one. Because there are a ton of woodwind parts in this. Just due to the requirements we kind of have for MCO and the intent to be sort of as inclusive of whatever instruments people bring as we can. Brass only ends up with 3, and then strings usually only have two lines to deal with. It just has to do with the number of parts I need to see at a time and how independent they might get. So yeah, there's still some arranging that hasn't happened. Like there's whole sections that I haven't figured out a texture for yet. I'm starting to do that now, and then starting to kind of get the pre-orchestration in there. So here it's like, okay, it's going to be a bunch of woodwinds. Looks like brass is mostly resting. On top of that, percussion is in view as well. So pre-orchestration is again, every note with these processes, going from reduction to pre-orchestration, orchestration, there's no notes really added for the most part that weren't in the previous step. So it almost becomes kind of a copy-paste thing. There is a little bit of like puzzle solving to go on here, like I might need to dovetail parts, or sort of reconfigure what's going on a little bit to make it idiomatic for the instruments. But again, the important thing about this process is that what notes are in the previous step continue into the next step. And then the percussion staves are there as well, so that's just getting taken care of at the same time. There's moments where the percussion is impactful enough where I definitely want to hear it, or just make sure that I'm writing that at the same time as the rest of the orchestration. It doesn't really get included in the original round for the most part, in the original reduction, because it's like non-pitched material unless it's doing something soloistic. So again, we've gone back to arranging. So I've reduced the number of staves I'm looking at, just to finish arranging this later section of the piece. And then once we're there, it's again a lot of kind of copy and pasting into what I need. Sometimes there might be like a new rhythmic texture or something introduced, but but the notes always layer on top of each other, so the voicings themselves never really change. There's not like notes added down an octave or up an octave from where I would have originally planned on the reduction level. That's an easy kind of mistake I sometimes see made, is kind of just parts sort of arbitrarily being doubled up or down an octave without sort of looking how it might interfere with what's already there, and you end up with a lot of muddiness. The process of going from reduction to orchestration, it's sped up a lot by just knowing a lot of shortcuts within the software. I'm using Sibelius here, but Dorico has a lot of similar ones. Even MuseScore has a couple filters like this too. So I can copy a section and then paste it, have it automatically blown out onto, or exploded out is the term they use, onto multiple staves. If it's a chord, I can filter out a specific voice of that chord, the top note or the middle note or the bottom note or whatever it is, and just get those out. Or sometimes for rhythmic figures, it's also possible to filter out, say, just the second beat of every measure. And that can be a very useful filter. So I'm not really re-inputting notes by hand at this point, but using copy and pasting, filtering, occasionally re-entering a note if it just isn't like straightforward enough to do that. But the shortcuts are what really speeds up this process once everything's written. So one development I made doing this arrangement, I used to have fewer pre-orchestration staves, because the more staves you get, the more detailed it gets, like the less useful it tends to be at that point. You might as well just write to the score. But I in fact did not have enough, and I realized the goal of the pre-orchestration was to just think in, or just to have things on a more easier to see level. So rather than looking at 14, 15, however many woodwind staves there are, I'm looking at just 4. But I got a little more detailed with them. I used to only have 2 woodwind staves and 2 brass staves, and it was a treble clef and a bass clef one. and that was it. And so everything would be on one or the other. In the case of woodwinds, it was like just 2 bassoons on the bottom staff, but then all of the woodwinds on the top one. And that became actually like harder to deal with because it was just too many parts trying to be reduced. And oftentimes, at least in my writing, the flutes are usually doing fairly different stuff from the oboes and clarinets. And in this case, I needed to deal with saxophones as well. So just having the 2 staves would have been like really messy and difficult to tell what I was actually going for or use them in a practical way. So I added more, and I'm actually going to start doing that going forward. Probably go with always having 3 for the woodwinds at least, and then 3 for the brass as well, so I can separate out horns, trumpets, and low brass. Easy enough. Strings don't really need a third one. There's only 5 string parts ordinarily, and the 2 lines is almost always perfectly sufficient. The ending got changed here. The original ending was only like 4 bars and pretty similar to the original track. But I decided to sort of elongate it a bit and make it more of a callback to the introduction, which is sort of slowed down from the original as well. So now we're actually properly arranging out the original and then adding all the extra details. Some of these details, as the orchestration happens, it's going to be hard to catch some of this because it's moving so fast. But like in the sketch, I have it shown that last chord's going to be tremoloed. Of course, the strings are going to do that. But other instruments, I want to adapt that effect to make sense for them. So like flutes are playing at the end, I believe, and they're trilling instead of tremoloing. So like little details like that aren't necessarily going to be reflected in the reduction or even the pre-orchestration necessarily. It might be at that phase, but not necessarily. But will be dealt with when I actually do the final orchestration. So here is me finally orchestrating. So I actually apparently have probably finished pre-orchestrating and arranging, and now we're actually finally sticking the notes to the proper staves, doing the proper final orchestration bit. So right now in view, I only have the 5 string lines and then the string pre-orchestration. The strings are generally the easiest to deal with because it's the most uniform section and the fewest number of parts overall. And as we can hopefully see, it is literally me just copying and pasting from the pre-orchestration staves up to the main string staves. And now we've moved on to brass, which is a little bit more involved. Not necessarily all that more difficult. There's just more parts to deal with. But there might be like some more intertwined stuff to kind of have to manage, such as how we have 3 trombones and then a euphonium as well as tuba. So there's just all these low brass, and they might not be arranged quite as linearly. So I can't just necessarily hit explode on the part and have it work out perfectly, because euphonium shouldn't be playing lower than bass trombone, which is what would happen by default if I did that. But for the most part, it's not super complex. I've already figured out, how I'm going to split these up. And even things like unisons are generally pretty well figured out in advance. So there's 3 trumpet parts, and like oftentimes there are 3 notes in the pre-orchestration. But if there's 2 notes, then I will generally have it marked if which of those 2 notes is doubled for the 3 parts. In fact, brass is already done, and we've moved on to woodwinds, which is definitely the most complicated one to deal with, because woodwinds are pretty varied in their tone. We have saxophones in here, which are kind of unique traits. Woodwinds are often going to be playing kind of faster material. There might be a lot of dovetailing going on, and the dovetailing isn't necessarily worked out entirely in the pre-orchestration. That's something I don't really deal with until it finally gets copied to each staff. Still though, it's I hope it kind of reveals how much easier it can be to just work on those fewer staves at first, rather than if I tried to approach this just from straight to score, which is, how I wrote for many years until I was actually forced in grad school to follow this kind of method. And when I was forced to do that, I quickly learned how beneficial it could be to just be working from fewer stuff. So this is a good example. Like all these woodwind runs here are not necessarily figured out, like how they're going to end or dovetail in the pre-orchestration. I sort of figured that out at this point because it's not. It would be too messy to even work that out on the pre-orchestration stabs, and not really that important because they're there for an effect. So I just need to kind of figure that out later. So not every detail is there yet, but most of them are, and so it's a pretty quick process to get everything onto its individual staves. Staves. Sometimes I say one or the other. I believe staves is the correct plural, but whatever. Occasionally you'll see like hidden stuff. There's a ton of hidden, not notes, but like dynamics and stuff I'll put in to help the playback sound a little more accurate. So for the most part, percussion was arranged, but now, I'm not working on percussion yet. I think I was about to, and then decided I didn't want to deal with it yet. Instead, the last part I'm actually adding in are these rhythm section parts. So there's a piano part, there's harp. Those aren't necessarily rhythm section, but piano kind of is in this case. And then a guitar and bass part. To be honest, these were, I'm not going to say they're afterthoughts, but they were not intended to be integral parts to the arrangement. This goes back to the original sort of philosophy behind this arrangement, which is that I want it to sound orchestral. I don't want it to sound like a rock song. And so the guitar parts are meant to slide into what's already there. I wanted the textures and the feel of this to be carried by the orchestra and not by the rhythm section. So there's no drum set, and there's the guitar because it was an MCO requirement we have that the guitarists actually have something to play, but it's meant to fit into what's already there. You'll notice though that I don't really write notes for the guitar. I do write notes in for playback, and then I hide them and just give them these slash note heads, because that is significantly easier for most guitarists to deal with than actually reading notes, for two reasons. One is it is just simply easier to read that they need to play a chord and to play it in some kind of rhythm. But also most arrangers are not also guitarists, and any voicings you try to write will probably not be very good guitar voicing. So this leaves the voicing up to the guitarist, which they've already got memorized. Guitarists typically like learn just chord shapes and such at first anyway, and so they'll see that chord and know what to grab. And that's better than me trying to dictate it exactly what to write, which I would do incorrectly anyway. So guitar and bass have been arranged, and piano as well, I think. And now we're actually getting to percussion. So I've already arranged the percussion, but I need to, at this point, figure out how the parts are going to fit together. Because it's just sort of like, I think, I want to hear cymbals here or whatever, and I write that in. But now I need to actually fit this onto fewer parts. In a normal orchestra, let's say a normal full-size orchestra, you might expect a maximum of 5 percussion parts, including timpani. And I'm trying to aim for that here because I want this arrangement to be practical beyond the life of the MCO. But for the purposes of the MCO, we have so many percussionists that there's not really a limit on the parts. But I don't want the score to get unreadable by having everything on its own line. So I'm trying to find the minimum number of lines I can use to get the percussion on here. And I kind of mulled over a couple options for producing these parts before settling on what I did here, which was that 2 of the parts do require 2 players. I generally go for 1 part per player, but like there's a snare drum and bass drum put together that needed to be 1 part, or that needs 2 players but is on 1 part, and that's just to reduce the overall number of stabs on the score more than anything. But otherwise, I think this arrangement requires like 7 or 8 percussionists. to actually pull off successfully. So, but some parts could reasonably be ignored. What I'm actually doing now is producing the reduced score. So, but when I was orchestrating, we had like flute 1, flute 2, clarinet 1, etc. But the score itself is going to have some of those, is going to have those combined. So flute 1 and 2 will be on one staff, and clarinets 1 and 2 will be on one staff. And I'm doing that reduction part. Now, the last one you just saw was the choir, which on the score is reduced to sopranos and altos on one staff and tenors and basses on another, but in the part, they all have their own staff. So I'm creating those reduced staves at this point. This can technically be done automatically, or I could have just had one staff to start with. And there's a feature in both Dorco and Sibelius to decondense those parts. Sibelius has not always had this feature, so it's not really part of my workflow to use it. And so far when I've used it, it has not been as solid, I guess. It's been a little bit buggy for me so far, so I'm waiting for them to maybe make it better before I put it as part of my workflow. But it would be nice, because when you have a score this huge with this many staves, it starts to actually bog down the program and move a bit slower than I would like. So the entire file actually has, flute 1 and flute 2, and then a third staff that's flute 1 and 2 combined that only shows up on the score, even though the parts themselves are separated, which is pretty standard practice. It's always best to not be combining these parts together. Makes it easier to read for the players. Percussion might be an exception to this. Some percussionists do like reading from a percussion score, and that's not uncommon in a recording session. I think at this point I've done all my reductions. I'm sort of just double checking everything, running through the score, making sure it looks nice, and sort of doing some formatting here on the actual score. Going through the parts. I think the parts formatting is not going to be part of this video, but I did do some basic applied a template to everything, which takes care of honestly 90% of the work, and then I kind of just have to go in and make sure the page breaks are nice. Most of what I have at this point is done automatically, because I've set up all the settings I like behind the scenes and all that. So once you lock those in, you create a house style, and it's going to take care of most of the work for you. I guess I'm still working out the percussion staff, so still finishing the arrangement. I think I hadn't finished the harp part yet. Formatting the score, you'll see I'm actually trying to get the page breaks to be good. A big common mistake is there's being too many measures per page, which makes it actually more difficult to read. And that's about the whole process there. So thanks for watching this if you got through all 30 minutes of this time lapse.